Hi, welcome to Anthropology 2351. So my name is Alfonso R. Lopez, and I will provide a very concise lecture on the historical background of race. So if we can just go rather quickly to our slideshow. So now, as Professor Martinez explained, concepts of race are relatively recent events, recent phenomena, considering how long humans have been on this planet. It is only in the last perhaps 4 to maybe 500 years when humans began to think in terms of races. In other words, that the human race, which is only one race, the human species, that is to say, is conformed of a multiplicity of different races. Well, again, this is really an artificial construct, is artificially constructed, that is to say, because there's no biological, real scientific basis for the existence of different races, that is to say. So again, this is something that is going to emerge in history. There will be specific historical, political, and economic reasons why this is going to arise. Why is it that suddenly about 400-500 years ago, we're going to see in different parts of the world, particularly, again, in places like Europe and America, why we're going to see the formulation of this idea, of this category that today we simply know as race. So that is the purpose of this very concise lecture. Again, it's just looking at the historical background. Why is it that historically we're going to see the rise of concepts of race? Okay. All right. So first and foremost, one of the first things to keep in mind here is that before the 1500s, when you look before the 1500s, looking back as far back as we can, all the way to the ancient world, all over the planet, the humans that inhabited this world did not really identify themselves in terms of race. Again, there was the absence of racial identity prior to the 1500s. Okay? There was, of course, social identities. Of course, there was group identity. Undeniable. People came together, formed groups, formed communities, formed associations, and they shared a common sense of identity. It is true. But it was never based on the idea of race, that, we are part of this particular race because we look alike, because we have similar physical markers or characteristics, and this is why we're considered to be a race. And others that don't look like us are different races. Again, that concept was absent prior to the 1500s, going back hundreds and thousands of years into the past. Identification, what we call group identity, were usually based on kinship. Kinship means an extended family, that is to say, people that actually are connected by birth or marriage. As an extended family group. That's what kinship is. So kinship groups, more often than not, prior to the 1500s, were simply known as tribes. In other words, there was a tribal identification. I'm a member of this particular tribe, somebody will say. Why? Well, because I live with people that are related to me. This is, my relatives, my family, and so on, my extended family, and so on. This is my group, okay? This is my particular group. This is my tribe. And those that do not belong to my tribe, are members of different tribes. But remember, this is not really racial identification. It's tribal, if you will, okay? Or kinship. It is the most technical term, again, kinship. In other words, my extended family. Again, and this was really dominant and all over the world, in the ancient world. How people actually identified themselves for the most part was based on kinship. Now, there will come a time, of course, with the rise of kingdoms, when we're going to see, of course, the rise of particular cities in the ancient world, in the Middle East, in India, for example, China, Egypt, and so on, Europe as well. Some of those cities are going to expand and become large kingdoms, of course. And those kingdoms, more often than not, also incorporated many tribal groups into the kingdom. So we're going to see the formation of new political communities. Those are actually communities composed of a multiplicity of different tribal groups. Each tribe had their own languages, their own traditions, but they were living under the rule of one single monarch or king. They lived in a kingdom. So we're going to see another kind of identification on the rise in the ancient world. And that was an identification based on kingdom. In other words, that people identify themselves as subjects of a particular king. For example, in Europe, people will say, well, I am the subject of King Henry of England, for example, in the 1500s, let us just say. Okay? That's just one example of subject of King Charles, again, in Spain, or, Queen Elizabeth in Spain, or King Ferdinand, the kings of Spain, for example. The people identify themselves, again, based also on a political affiliation, that they lived under the rule of a monarch in a particular kingdom. And again, this is not racial at all. As a matter of fact, those kingdoms were composed of many tribal groups, and so they tended to be a little bit diverse. Not all of them, but again, the tendency was that kingdoms tended to incorporate a wide variety of different tribal groups. Now, another form of group identification prior to the 1500s that was very typical was identification based on culture and religion. People who share your same culture or your same faith were seen as members of a single community, for example. Okay. So let's say, for example, in Europe, okay, in Europe, people did not really identify themselves as Europeans, nor in Africa. When you see the continent of Africa, for example, contained hundreds and hundreds of different cultural groups, linguistic groups, and so on. And the people there did not really identify themselves as Africans. They didn't really say, okay, look, I'm an African versus, let's say, somebody that is from Europe and that is a European. Again, those concepts had not yet emerged historically. So Europeans did not really identify themselves as Europeans, but rather they identified themselves either with their kingdom on one hand, but also with their culture and religion. They will say, well, for example, I'm a Catholic, okay? And I am different than, let us just say, Protestants. We're going to see, of course, in Europe, the division between Protestant Christians and Catholics, of course. They're both Christians, but they do have different beliefs. And so again, Europeans did not really come together and said, okay, look, we're all simply Europeans because we have similar physical characteristics that distinguish us from peoples around the world. I mean, that really concept was not there. People identify themselves with their culture, with their religion, whether it was Protestant or Catholic, or for example, in Islam in the Middle East, there's going to be the creation of a common identity across the Middle East because of Islam. Again, Islam provided pretty much, again, a common source of identity as well. People who adhere to that faith, regardless of tribal associations or live in different kingdoms, if they share the same faith, they believe to be, again, members of a single community as well. Okay, so this is how people identify themselves prior to the 1500s. Okay, quite different from the ways that we're going to see after the 1500s, how we're going to see the early origins of what today we call the concept of race, how people are going to start thinking about human differences, certain physical characteristics that people share in common as to be the byproduct of coming from a different racial grouping or different racial category. So again, this is extremely important. We have to understand how this process came about. Why is it that people are beginning to think in terms of race, if they're different from other peoples because of the way they appear physically? Why is it that they're going to think that they were simply a different race from the other people that they saw or encountered? And the early origins of race had to do precisely with the discovery of America in 1492. That's, again, the very early origins of the concept of race. This is a time when the Europeans were beginning to move out of Europe. They had new technologies, larger vessels, ships that they used in order to explore the world around them. They were moving into places like Africa in the mid-15th century and mid-1400s. The Portuguese were beginning to arrive to Africa, for example, in pursuit of trade. Their idea is that they wanted to tap into the spices of the Far East, the silks coming from China, the exotic products, again, of the Far East. And so they were really trying to find trade routes, trying to navigate their way around the world and trying to explore it. So in this exploration, they ended up discovering, of course, a new continent in 1492, and that was the continent of America. What the discovery of America did was, again, set off a new age, a totally new world age in human history, and that was the age of encounters. The age of encounters. This is the very first time in human history when all of the civilizations, all of the cultures, and all of the peoples of the world are going to start meeting and encountering one another. Okay, this is the very, very first time. Europeans are encountering for the first time the Native Americans. The Native Americans, likewise, for the first time, are going to encounter the Europeans. But as I mentioned, the Europeans are also arriving into Africa, for the spice trade, or, later on, of course, the slave trade. And they're meeting the peoples of Africa. Not that they were unaware of them, but there will be close encounters, again, with the peoples of Africa. More permanent relationships, if you will, are established. And so, again, there's going to be a meeting, if you will, of all of the peoples of the world. And of course, the Europeans are also arriving to India in the early 1500s, and also to China as well, establishing trading networks, connections, and we see the beginning of international trade. And so again, the age of encounters was an encounters of the peoples of the world, and this really caused certain cultural shocks, if you will, to different groups of people, because for the first time they're meeting human beings that look radically different from how they looked. They have never seen humans so different, than the ones that they were accustomed to see on a day-to-day basis. So again, this was a true landmark time, if you will, that pretty much set off new ideas all over the world. People pretty much trying to explain, where those peoples were coming from. Are those gods? Are those spirits? Why is it that human beings look so different from us, etc. Again, this is something that caused a lot of commotion, if you will, in the minds and hearts of millions of people around the world. In the American continent, we see also the Europeans beginning a process of colonization. In other words, it was not just a meeting, again, of Native Americans for the purpose of trade. The Europeans are also coming over in order to establish trading outposts. Eventually, they're building colonies, colonizing, settling the New World as well. And again, it's a process that took centuries, from the 1500s all the way to the 1700s, several centuries worth of this process of colonization and exploration as well. They were exploring the continent, discovering, of course, a wide diversity of life and cultures, of course, in the New World. I mean, the plants, for example, the vegetables, the species of, for example, vegetation and trees and medicinal plants that the Europeans were barely encountering upon in the New World were totally unknown in the rest of the world, let alone in Europe. I mean, all over the world. I mean, there's been ideas again about how, certain plants will look like. And again, all of that was coming out again, a great diversity of life, not only in terms of vegetation, but also animals as well. Animals that were totally unknown to the rest of the world were being also discovered. And this is going to create an intellectual curiosity all over the world as to what was really the origin of all of this diversity. Why is it that there's a great diversity of plants? Why there's a great diversity of animals? And of course, a great diversity also of cultures as well. Why human cultures are also so different from one another. And also the diversity among human populations. And that when you look, for example, at Native Americans, there's a great diversity within the Native American world, if you will. Again, not all Native Americans, share, if you will, exactly the same physical markers or characteristics. There's even great diversity within the Native American social world. But when you look at Africa, the same holds true in Africa. Again, that there's a great diversity of peoples and cultures as well in Africa. And there's, of course, a great diversity of life in terms of vegetation and animals that were totally, again, unknown in many cases to the rest of the world. So this is the age of discovery. This is the age of encounters, the age of exploration, if you will, that is giving rise to new sciences. In other words, people require some form of explanation as to why life is just so different and so diverse in the planet. Okay, so again, the discovery of America is going to set off all of that. Those types of questions. Why do we look so different? And this is going to give rise to new sciences, sciences that are geared to explain the origin of life and explain why is there so much diversity as well. Diversity of vegetation, animals, human beings, and also human cultures and languages as well. We're going to see, for example, the rise of biology during this time. Okay, I will talk more about it again in the end of this very concise lecture. But again, biology, the study of life, will be one of the new sciences that is on the rise. Anthropology had its early origins during this process as well, in terms of people trying to study human cultures and the like. Again, so we're going to see the rise of new fields of knowledge that are endeavoring to explain diversity, if you will. Okay. The American continent, however, as the Europeans are now proceeding to colonize it and establish a series of colonies for the purpose of extracting resources for international trade, again, so there is a commercial, of course, purpose for this process of colonization. Europeans were not just coming to America to colonize it because Europe was simply overpopulated and there was no more room for people to live, but rather the Americas was seen as a land of opportunity, commercial opportunity, a land that contained abundant natural wealth and resources that could be used for international trade, for the creation of different enterprises like plantations and mining industries, for example, cattle ranches, fur trading companies, you name it. So there was a wide variety of different enterprises that the Europeans were establishing in the New World, in the Americas, and in the process of establishing those companies and those trading operations, they built colonies within them. Okay? So the Europeans are settling in the New World, and accompanied with this settlement, Europeans are also bringing with them, starting in the 15th, 16th, and 1700s, a great number of African slaves into the American colonies for the purpose precisely of extracting either minerals from the ground, like silver, for example, or growing certain crops like tobacco, coffee, sugar, and other products. So that we're going to see an influx not only of Europeans into this continent, but also we're going to see an influx of African slaves. So the Americas will become, in the centuries between the 1500s and the 1700s, what is called a motley of peoples. Okay? It is really a collage of different peoples that are now living together for the first time, a multiplicity of people that have different cultural, ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds. They're all coming together to share the same space and live under a single society, a colonial society. They're Native Americans, there are European settlers, and there are also African, of course, people that are arriving into the New World as well. Okay? So again, this is really, again, creating the conditions for the formulation of racial categories in the Americas. The Americas were like a laboratory, if you will, for the formulation of new kinds of identities, because now we see peoples coming from different parts of the world living together. And eventually, what is going to happen is that the colonial powers that were in charge of this process of colonization, for example, in this case, we're talking about the Spanish Empire. Okay, so the Spanish Empire is going to be fundamental in the formulation of racial categories, is the forerunner, let it just say, the Spanish Empire, in actually formulating those very first artificial concepts of race that applied exclusively to the colonial societies in the New World. Okay? How this process came into being? Well, first and foremost, the Spaniards had great difficulties understanding human diversity. Not because they couldn't, it's just because this is the first time that they're confronting, okay, the existence of peoples that were not even mentioned in the Christian Bible. Of course, the Spaniards were known as to be very fervent Catholics, and they are coming into the New World to convert the Native American population. That's what they wanted, again, to pretty much spread Christianity in the New World. But they're also puzzled at the fact that they have never even heard of the Native Americans, even in their own Bible. So in the very beginning of this process of trying to spread Christianity in the New World, the Spanish authorities, the Spanish colonial authorities, were even wondering whether the Native Americans were even human, because, you know, the Bible doesn't mention them. So if the Bible doesn't mention them, maybe, they said, we're wasting our time. You know, maybe, you know, we're not supposed to be spreading Christianity here, because ultimately, you know, it's almost like, you know, it's a futile attempt to be spreading Christianity among creatures that do not possess humanity, in other words. Okay? So this is going to set off a great debate in Spain. You know, it's called the Great Debate. Are the natives human? There was actual an intellectual debate between two great figures, two great personalities in Spain. One was Bartolomé de las Casas, who was immediately in the very beginning of Spanish colonization in the early 1500s. He was sent into the colony of New Spain, what today is the country of Mexico, to be the bishop of one of the provinces of New Spain, the bishop of Chiapas, and that's in southeast Mexico, by the way. So Bartolomé de las Casas was a friar. He was a religious figure. He's coming from the Catholic Church. He's a missionary. He's a bishop of course, and he's coming for the purpose of converting the natives. But Bartolomé de las Casas is complaining at this time in the early 1500s that the Spanish landowners, the owners of the large landed estates, the ranches, and so on, were exploiting the natives, ruthlessly, and that they were obstructing the process of evangelization. In other words, that we cannot truly convert the natives to Christianity as long as the Spanish colonial authorities are exploiting the native population, because the natives are simply not really interested in Christianity. They're rejecting Christianity because they see it as a foreign religion that is not really consistent with the teachings of Christ, because the Christians themselves, the Spaniards, are not behaving like Christ, full of compassion and mercy and the like. They're actually just exploiting the natives, in other words. So they don't see Christianity as something that they want to embrace. So Bartolomé de las Casas wrote a great number of letters, of course, to the Spanish king, saying, look, we need to stop the exploitation of the natives if we are to pursue this process of conversion successfully. The natives need to be converted because they are indeed human, whereas the other figure, the opposing figure back in Spain that defended, of course, the colonial authorities and the landowners, his name was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, argue otherwise. His argument was that the Native Americans were not mentioned in the Bible. So because they were not mentioned in the Bible, it was doubtful that they were human or even had a human soul, that is to say, worthy of saving, that is to say. So he was just trying to justify, if you will, the actions of the Spanish officials of New Spain, and saying, look, so this might be a mistreatment of the Indians, it's brutal, etc. But in reality, again, there's no sin attached to this. We're not really sinning because the Bible doesn't mention, the natives. They're not actually part of humanity, in other words. And there was a great debate. Bartolomé de las Casas actually goes to Spain and holds actually public debates with Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. Those were public, in public universities. And this was the ongoing debate. This became the great debate. Are natives actually human? Are they part of the human species? In other words. Okay, so luckily for Bartolomé de las Casas, the argument went in his favor, that indeed the natives were considered human and they needed to be converted, that there was, again, the need to save their soul. Again, so we're going to see, of course, a shift here in terms of incorporating the Native American population into the human kingdom. So, indeed, we're going to see the Spanish Empire continuing to spread Christianity, send more missionaries into the New World. But eventually, they faced another problem. And the other problem that is going to lead to the formulation of racial categories has to do with colonial rebellions, that in many cases the indigenous peoples revolted against the Spanish. In some cases, those rebellions were assisted or aided by either African slaves on one hand, or they were also assisted by some Spanish settlers as well, whether those were members of the elite, some of them were members of the church that favored the indigenous population and their problems, and they wanted to help them. And so we see outbursts of colonial revolts or colonial rebellions. So the Spanish Empire in the 1500s needed a system of colonial control, a social control mechanism. How do you indeed control colonies that are 3,000 miles away? Okay? So far removed from Spain. The mother country, Spain, is 3,000 miles away. Okay, so how do you actually control societies that are so far removed from you and that contain populations that are extremely diverse and do not have a certain connection to the mother country, cultural connection or religious connection or ethnic connection of any kind. How do you do that? How do you actually control societies so far away from you that are extremely diverse and have no connections to you? The solution for this was to divide the colonial population along what is now called or termed racial categories. In other words, the Spanish monarchy and the governing councils, again, surrounding the monarch, decided that the best course of action for successfully controlling the colonies in the other side of the Atlantic was to divide the colonial population along race. In other words, that, well, okay, so we do have to indeed separate people in a way that, for example, the indigenous peoples are going to be termed one single category. They're going to belong to a certain category in which they're going to be part of a distinct and different race. This had a lot to do with the great debate that I just explained in the previous slide. In other words, the great debate was, well, are the natives actually human or are they part of the animal kingdom? Well, if indeed the answer is that the natives are part of the human kingdom, they're human. The second question is, why is it that they look so different from the rest of other human beings? Not only from Europeans, but also from Africans. Why is it that the natives look very different from the peoples of the Middle East, from Asia, and the like? Why is it that there's great diversity, again, among the human population? If we're all human, if we all belong to this one single human kingdom, why is it that there are indeed great diversity? So the answer came in the form of, well, we're different because we are indeed different races of human beings. Yes, we're all human, but we are different because we belong to different racial groups. We're different kinds of races of human beings, in other words. So the Native Americans are indeed different kinds of human beings, and the peoples of Africa are different kinds of human beings, and so on and so forth. So this is an artificial categorization of human differences, if you will. Okay, how do you categorize human differences? We say, well, differences arise because those are racial differences, that is to say. Okay, so again, we're going to see now the Spanish dividing the colonial population along different races, in other words, of people. And that's exactly what is arising in the 15th and moving into the 1600s, is that the Spanish Empire is now creating a new social structure that is going to apply to the colonies. Again, so this is applied exclusively to the Spanish colonies. Not necessarily to Spain, but rather the mother country, but rather the colonies in the New World. So we see a new social structure. And this new social structure was actually a racial caste system, or a hierarchy of races. In other words, it created a hierarchy of races, ranking people according to their race from superior to less superior, all the way to the bottom, which was considered, of course, inferior. So this is a racial caste system. At the very top of this hierarchy were the Spaniards, which were members of the nobility back in Spain, born in Spain. They were known as the Peninsulars or Peninsulares. If you were born in the Iberian Peninsula out of noble parents, in the colonies, you will be on the very top positions of society. The heads of the church, for example, and also the highest political offices. The highest political offices, like the governors, for example, of the provinces, the viceroys, which was really the representative of the Spanish monarch in the colonies, those had to be Peninsulares. And those were considered to be a separate race. Again, it's artificial, that to say if you're Spanish nobility born in Spain, you are considered a peninsular, which is actually a racial category. And so you're going to be, of course, leading the colonies, the religious institutions, political institutions. Below them were the criollos. Those are actually Spaniards, full 100% Spaniards, but they were born in America. And just by virtue of being born in America, they were considered to be a separate race. Separate race, here we have, Spaniards, totally 100% Spaniards, but the difference is that if you were born in Spain, you're from a different race, but if you're born in America, you're considered a different race, okay? And the criollos were like the upper middle class, so to speak, okay, of the colonies. They could be landowners, they could be the owners of haciendas or ranches, in this case. They could be the priest, enter the priesthood and enjoy privilege inside of the church. They could not be the leaders of the church, but they were the administrators and, of the church, priests and so on. Like the upper middle class, they lived relatively well, etc., but they could not have political power. They were deprived of political power, and the criollos were considered, once again, a separate race. Below them were people of mixed ancestry that have Spanish ancestors and native ancestors. They were known as the mestizos. They were also categorized as a separate race. They were known as a separate caste or race, that is to say. The mestizos. They did not have so much economic status. In many cases, they assisted the landowners. They were like the lower middle class, if you will. Those were the supervisors, the foreman, pretty much assisting the ranchers of large properties and the like. So their status is, of course, inferior in society to the criollos and much inferior to the peninsulares, of course. Below the mestizos were the Indians, or the indigenous peoples is a better term. The Native Americans or the indigenous peoples were now seen as a separate race or racial category when, in fact, as I just mentioned a few moments ago, there was great diversity among the Native American groups. Linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity. You cannot just lump them together and say, well, yes, indeed, there's great diversity between all of the different groups of natives, of course, indeed, but in reality, they form or they constitute a single race. So this is an artificial concept as well that lumped pretty much all indigenous peoples of this continent together under a single racial grouping, that is to say, and they were known as the Indios or Indians in this case. And just below them were the African slaves. As I mentioned, those were slaves that were brought by the Europeans, in this case the Spaniards first. The French will also bring their own slaves into the French colonies, and the British as well. And the African peoples were seen as a separate race, despite the fact that the African peoples came from a continent that housed a wide array of different ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups that were extremely distinct from one another. But nonetheless, just by virtue of sharing certain common characteristics, for example, skin color, well, that was enough to lump them together, again, under a single racial category. Once again, an artificial concept as well. So again, this is something that is historically now emerging for the first time, is that we see the emergence of the concept of race, and is emerging in the American continent, in the colonies, again, particularly of Spain in the 15 and 1600s. Of course, colonial empires, like I mentioned, the French and the British, who are also colonizing the New World. They're building colonies on their own. Colonies that will also have diversity of peoples as well, including African slaves. Those colonial empires are going to adopt the Spanish model. Not only France, but also Portugal. The Portuguese in Brazil, again, in the 1600s, all the way to the 1800s, they're also building this caste system that was identical to the Spanish. They started dividing the population along caste, or race, and putting on top, for example, members of the nobility that were born in Portugal to be the heads of the state of Brazil and the church. And just below them will be, of course, Portuguese people born in Brazil that had economic power, but not political power. And so you go down the line all the way to the African slaves at the very bottom as well. So we got, once again, another instance of another European colony in the New World, Brazil, led by the Portuguese, that is creating a similar social structure, dividing the population along racial lines as well, that are artificially constructed. The British in North America follow suit, and they're also going to incorporate the same system, the same social structure into some of their North American British colonies, like Virginia, for example, South Carolina, and Georgia. Those southern colonies, those are the southern colonies that had, of course, large slave populations, are also going to integrate a very similar racial division of society, dividing people along different racial categories as well. English born in England are going to be the governors, for example, of those colonies. Englishmen that are nobility born in the colonies are going to be the planters, the plantation owners, the owners of those great plantations growing cotton, for example, and tobacco. And below them will be just ordinary British people that had no ties to nobility. They're going to be the farmers. And below them will be, of course, the African slaves that will be providing the work in the plantations and the like. Again, dividing people in that fashion. And of course, the idea was that it was prohibited for people of different castes to actually marry. That was the implication, again, of the caste system, is dividing people along that way. They have different status, different responsibilities, different functions in society, but also it prohibited the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British empires in the colonies, did not allow for the intermarriage, again, of those different castes to take place. So if you were born on one caste, you were to marry somebody from your own caste. If you were born a farmer in Virginia, more than likely you're going to be marrying again the daughter of another farmer. If you were a planter, in South Carolina, more than likely you will marry into another family of planters as well. Again, they marry the same caste. So again, this created a certain tension and division within the society as well, because people were trapped, if you will, on a certain category and could not get out because they were labeled as such, and it was prohibited to actually mingle and mix with other castes as well. Okay. All right, so what we have seen so far is that this racial categorization came as a result of colonialism. This process of colonialism or colonization. When the Europeans were colonizing the New World, the empires were governing very diverse populations composed of Europeans, Native American groups, and of course, African slaves that were brought to work in those enterprises. And what we see is the problem of colonial revolts is that one of the problems that those empires faced was the fact that the colonial populations very often revolted against the colonial authorities, whether those were Native American groups assisted by African slaves, or there were actually slave revolts as well that threatened, if you will, the colonial rule. That led to the need to control colonial populations. How do we actually prevent people from coming together and uniting against the empire? Well, one way is to separate them racially, that is to say, give them separate status, a separate label, a separate category, put them in different positions of society, so there will be no unification. That is to say, so again, it came as really the concept of race as a social control mechanism for colonial societies, that is to say, in the Americas, that is to say, to divide the colonies along racial lines or racial castes, if you will. And so this set off the beginning, historically speaking, of racial identifications. for the first time, starting in the 15 and 1600s, we're going to see people identifying themselves with a race. This is not an immediate or sudden process. It takes, of course, time for people to start thinking in terms of race. But this is the beginning of this process of people now thinking that there are different races in the world, okay? In terms of the differences, the great diversity that exists among, the human kingdom, think in terms of racial differences. Again, when indeed those are artificially constructed. And those were constructed out of the necessity, again, of colonial empires to provide a social control mechanism to maintain, if you will, stability in the colonies, if you will, stability and order. Now, of course, as we move into the 1700s and 1800s, those initial ideas of race will enter the world of science. Okay? Racial concepts will find their way into the realm of scientific inquiry as well. Now, it's not just a matter of certain empires labeling people in their colonies in terms of race, but rather, this is what scientists are going to be thinking about in those particular centuries I just mentioned, because there is a scientific revolution taking place between the 17 and 1800s. There's the rise of a new science. Okay, we're going to see the rise of modern science. This is the science that we use today to conduct research, where we actually look into the world and trying to observe it and trying to gather material evidence and facts in order to proclaim a certain truth. In other words, to really study the world of nature, to understand how it works, we need to actually observe nature with our senses, again, and pretty much try to gather material evidence, again, to discover anything. So again, this new science gave birth, as I said in the beginning of this lecture, again, to biology, the study of life, that is to say, this is really largely inspired by the discovery of the New World, by the Europeans, and of course the Age of Encounters, when the great diversity of life and cultures is becoming more dominant around the world. This led to, of course, scholars, intellectuals, scientists to try to discover why there's so much diversity in the world, okay? Trying to understand the origins of life. And of course, one of the greatest biologists, again, of the 1800s was Charles Darwin, who was the father of the theory of evolution. He wanted to explain the origin of life in general, just in general, the origin of life. And he proposed that life has been evolving for millions and millions of years from simple organisms or simple cells that transform themselves into the great diversity of life that exists in this world. Okay, the great diversity of plants and animals and human beings emerged from this process of evolution. Again, that for millions and millions of years, simple cells evolved and became more complex, and they created different life forms, and they adapted to different environments, and over time they became really the biosphere, the world of life in general in the world. Okay, now he was also very interested in human differentiation, why there is so much difference among human beings, why human beings are so different from one another. Like I mentioned, this is a great intellectual pursuit that came as a result of the Age of Discovery and the Age of Encounters. So he proposed that the reason why humans are so different from one another is precisely because we are part of different racial groups. In other words, that the human species is actually composed of very different kinds of different racial groups, human races, that is to say. That is his explanation for the incredible diversity and differences among human beings in terms of skin color, hair, you name it. All the physical characteristics that set one group of people apart from another, he categorized that indeed as being different because they're different races. And now again, this is a scientific proclamation. This is not just an opinion. This is not just a politician or a monarch saying, well, this is the way I'm going to organize my colony and so on. Again, this is a scientist that is now proclaiming this as truth, in other words. Okay, so eventually his ideas, Darwin's, are going to be used to study, genetics. Back in the 1800s, the study of genetics was known as eugenics. And that is, again, the study of trying to understand how is it that genes are passed on from one generation into another and affect, of course, the development of future generations. That means that we are inheriting all of the virtues and, of course, the flaws of our ancestors. And that is why we are the way we are. And the way that we look today, physically, our physical characteristics, the so-called racial differences, are also the byproduct of those genetic inheritance. In other words, we look this way in the present because our ancestors looked this way as well. Okay, so the genes are passed on, and that really provides the blueprint for how a human being looks in the present, and how those genes can be passed on to future generations, of course, affecting the development, whether in a positive or negative way, of individuals and groups of people. That led, indeed, the study of genetics to the need or the idea to create the perfect human. In other words, how do we create the perfect human? Well, the perfect human can be created by studying genetics, by studying our genetic history. If indeed we come from a very good genetic pool, whatever that thing is, that your ancestors were perhaps very successful, very intelligent, very brave, you name it, that there were high qualities, virtuous qualities, again, with very limited presence of disease, for example, as well. Well, that means that you have good genetics. And maybe if you mix your genes with a person that share also very good genes, you can create the perfect human. But it's not just creating the perfect human. There's also the idea of creating the perfect race. That, well, maybe there are races that are superior, that have certain characteristics that are superior to other races. Groups of people that are more intelligent, they're more virtuous, more creative in the world of music, in the world of philosophy, in the world of architecture, in the world of politics, religion. Doesn't matter if they excel in all those areas. Well, maybe those groups of people, known as so-called races, can become indeed the perfect race if they only mix and mingle within themselves, again, and try to create the perfect race, and avoid mixing their genes with other races that are less superior, for example. So again, this is going to have profound implications as to how people are beginning to think in terms of race now that scientists are actually using this concept, a concept that we use for political reasons back in the 15, 16, and 1700s by the Spanish and Portuguese, the French, and the British to structure and control colonial populations, is now being used by science, and how this is leading now to a more scientific version of race, in which people are actually thinking that, well, this is science, this is what scientists are saying, so it must be true, and it must be real, that human differentiation, human differences are exactly that, racial differences, and that indeed we can create and perfect those races as well. Okay, so this is all I have for you. I hope this helped you understand the historical development of this concept. Now I turn your attention now to Professor Martinez, who's going to now continue with this discussion and trying to now elaborate further into other concepts related to this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, class. I'm going to wrap it up here since we're out of time. But this, I hope you got a broader understanding of the construction of this idea of race. And we'll dive into our next class, the difference between race and ethnicity, and get into culture. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the class.